tonight is going to be a little bit different. I think I'm going to say that probably every week. So tonight, in the past, rather, let me highlight what is common in the past. In the past, what we would do is we would do the apologetic session at the end of service. Well, I think you guys will hopefully view it as a treat. We're going to do the apologetic session right now. And then as time permits, we will get into the service. And for the reasons of it's very difficult for the heart to embrace something that the mind finds to be foolish. Let me say that again. It's very difficult for the heart to embrace something that the mind views to be foolish or intellectually stupid. And so, how's that for an intro? So tonight we're going to actually talk about the issue of evil. And the issue of evil comes up very, very often. Matter of fact, without fail, if you're talking to a skeptic or an atheist or anybody of that sort, odds are you will have to provide a reason that there is evil in this world. You will have to find or define, or better yet, defend, which is also what is called a theodicy. A theodicy is being able to give a defense or a reason for how it is that evil can be in an existent amidst a holy God. Okay? So that's what is known as a theodicy. Now, having said that, if you do not take these principles or take this topic seriously, it is to your detriment. Which is to say that if you are a Christian who leaves the issues of morality or leaves the issues of death or suffering or evil in the world, and you allow that to be on the shoulders of more qualified individuals, it will only prove to be of your detriment. It is upon our shoulders and our individual responsibility to take the topic of evil seriously, because more often than not, the heart cannot embrace what the mind views as intellectual foolishness. And so for an atheist, for an agnostic, if we are going to be serious about spreading the gospel, we need to take the issue of evil seriously. Right? Because for one, there is an existential crisis, in which case we need to be diligent about offering that. Okay, so there's my segue. So the first thing I want to tackle is what is called God talk. Okay, God talk. There is a specific way to talk about God that is biblically and theologically and philosophically accurate, which is to say, I can say, for example, that this table is good. Okay? I can also say that the chair is good. I can also say that this book is good, which we'll find out later that it's not. That this book is good. However, what we mean by good varies dependent upon the thing we are calling good. Okay? A three-legged chair wouldn't be considered good, would it? No. Some could even call it evil or metaphysical evil. A topless table, for example, wouldn't be considered good, right? You have a table without a top. Would it? A book without an ending would not be considered good either. You see, we call things good based upon a standard, an ultimate standard that we apply to whatever we're talking about in that moment. A standard of what a chair should be, a standard of what a table should be, or a book. There's a standard, and it's not arbitrary. Rather, there are specific speculations, rules, or better yet, requirements in order for a thing to be considered good. You see, for Play-Doh, who here has ever heard of Play-Doh? Not the ones that you play with on the table with your mom and dad. Play-Doh the individual. Play-Doh, he called this world of forms. World of forms. He actually believed that there was another world out there, a metaphysical world, an invisible world, spiritual world, in which there existed a perfect chair, or a perfect table, or a perfect book. He wasn't so much speaking in terms of its essence as much as it was the requirements of that thing. So he believed there was perfect measurements of a chair. There's perfect measurements of a table. Okay? A world in which the table was perfect form, if you will. Okay? Or, another way to look at it, or perfect in purpose would be a better way to view this. It has purpose-fulfilling properties, one would say. And there existed a perfect form for everything. A chair, a table, a book, a road, fill in the blank. However, when we refer to God, we do not mean that God is good like our pizza is good, and or God is good like our chair is good, or our table, or even a book. Rather, God is independent of any requirements. God is good independent from anything that he does. Let me say that again. A chair is dependent upon meeting the requirements that a chair must meet in order to be considered good. Does that make sense? Are you with me? God, on the other hand, is independent from anything, including morals and moral absolutes. He doesn't need to be life in order to be considered good. He doesn't have anything as a standard for which he needs to grab hold of. Okay. God is good independent upon any moral standard, any logical standard, and or any metaphysical standard. God is not good like we are good. Let me say that again. God is not good like we are good. In order for a human being to be considered good, he must not commit murder. He must not commit certain actions. He must adhere to certain requirements in order for him to be good, like a chair were to be good. God does not have any standards or any requirements or any ultimate means of dependency, if you will. Are you with me?
Yeah.
Okay. You see, people think God is good like we are good, just exceptionally better. Okay? People think God's knowledge is like ours, just exceptionally more. Okay? Which is a mistake. People think that God's knowledge is like ours, just exceptionally more, or he just knows more than we do. No, God is not good like we are good. And God doesn't know things like we know things. You see, when you're speaking about God, you must be careful not to use what is called univocal language. Everybody say univocal.
Univocal.
Beautiful. Univocal language is a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning the exactness or sameness. So if I, for example, were to use univocal language, I would say this pizza is good and God is good. And the degree of goodness is the same, which is to say the exactness. You cannot use univocal language when describing God. And you can't use what is called equivocal language. Everybody say equivocal.
Equivocal.
Equivocal language has nothing to do with one another. I can't say, because I don't know how God is good, then it follows that because I don't know how he is good, then I can't define that pizza is good. Right? So they're complete opposites. Okay? I probably didn't explain that very well, but hopefully you can stay with me. Okay. What we should use is what is called analogical language, which is to say a language in which there is some sameness, some exactness, and there's some difference as well. Does that make sense? So when we say God is good, there's some sense of exactness, but there's also some sense of opposite as well, meaning to say that it's different kind of good. Are you with me? The goodness that God possesses is not dependent upon anything. That's what I want you to grasp. Okay? All right. Whenever we equate God to goodness, that we are being careful to use analogical language because he is not good like we are good, and he isn't so far out there that nothing we know or can say about God can be correct. Rather, analogical language, the ability to know that in some form or fashion we can talk about God and in other ways we cannot. Now, Now, having defined a little bit about goodness, now let's go into the topic of evil. What do we mean by evil? Because evil is something that cannot exist on its own. Let me say that again. Evil cannot exist on its own. What do I mean by that? Well, I want everyone in here to say or think of a negative statement or thought. For example, say or think that this chair is broken, or this chair is evil. You cannot think of, say, something negative without affirming the positive. Are you with me? Okay. For example, you can't say a thing is evil in the metaphysical sense. That is to say that a chair that doesn't fulfill its purpose without affirming that the chair had purpose to begin with. Okay? Evil in a metaphysical sense is something lacking. Evil in a metaphysical sense is something that is lacking. It is what many scholars actually call privation. Everybody say privation. Privation is something lacking. So, with that definition, what is evil? Evil is something that is lacking from its original or perfect purpose. For example, someone who is blind or deaf is lacking something. However, in order to identify the evil, the person must affirm that there was a perfect chair, a perfect eyeball, or perfect ears, or a perfect book. To call something evil, or to say that blindness is evil, or to have some type of birth defect, or some type of mental disorder, if you are to call that evil, you are assuming that being cognizant is good. Being able to have 20/20 eyesight is good. Evil cannot exist without presupposing a perfect moral standard or a perfect standard for that thing in which we're addressing. Hopefully you're with me up until this point. In order to call someone or something evil, you must affirm an ultimate standard of goodness to begin with. What do we mean by goodness? Something that is functioning in accordance to its design. Something that is functioning in an orderly fashion. You see, something that is good operates according to laws. Something that is good is something that is working in accordance to laws, with the exception of God. Okay? You guys with me? Now, if we are just goo to the zoo to you, and we're a cosmic miscarriage, right? We're just evolved pond scum, where do these ultimate standards come from? In terms of morally, that is. Think about that. Where do these ultimate standards of goodness pertaining to morality come from? How is someone capable of saying something is evil without presupposing an ultimate standard of goodness? You cannot call something evil unless there's an ultimate standard of goodness to begin with. You see, to sit here and say that there's no God because the existence of evil, it flies in the face of the one making this objection that they're using God's existence and his ultimate standard of goodness to call that thing evil. Where do these ultimate standards of goodness come from? Here's a syllogism. A syllogism is an argument for the existence of God for using morals. It's adhering, by the way, to all the laws of logic, and it's using what is called modus ponens. Everybody here say modus ponens. This is a law of logic that is used when making an argument. It fulfills that law of logic, which is to say this is a coherent and a tenable, and what most scholars or logicians would decree would be a valid argument. And it goes as follows. If moral absolutes exist, then God exists. Moral absolutes exist, therefore God exists. Let me say it again. If moral absolutes exist, then God exists. Moral absolutes exist, therefore God exists. Moral absolutes exist. For example, if there are any context where torturing babies for fun is considered okay, or is there any possibility of rape being considered okay in any possible world? Which is to say that if you believe that murder is wrong and you die and still murder remains wrong, it's a moral absolute. Right? Is there any such context in which torturing babies for fun would be considered okay? No. In any possible world. No. Even if you're in Africa. No. It doesn't matter where you are, torturing babies for fun is always a metaphysical, always objective moral evil. You see, by claiming that lying is wrong, you're assuming there's a truth to be told. Is morality, though, here's the key question, is morality like Baskin-Robbins' 31 flavors of ice cream? If the individual evolved to be a rapist or an axe murderer, is it just a consequence of their biological makeup? I would say so. If it's true that we're just evolved pond scum, a cosmic miscarriage, goo to the zoo to you, then it follows, that's cool, came right out of my throat, then it follows that I evolved to become an axe murderer. I evolved to be a murderer, does it not? Just Baskin-Robbins, 31 flavors of ice cream, baby. You just pick what's good for you. What your truth is your truth. If you want to have evolved to be an axe murderer, that's okay. If we're being consistent with evolution. You see, I was going to read you a story out of this book. Okay, it's called Free Will by Sam Harris. But it's pretty gruesome. This is a very renowned atheist. He was actually, as far as I remember, he's considered one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. That's what they call themselves. So they got Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens. They called themselves the four horsemen of the apocalypse pertaining to Christianity. So these four men made it their goal in life to debunk Christianity. Sam Harris wrote this book, and I'm not going to read the story out of his book, but I did grab a couple of key points to take away, and I'd like to share them with you. Sam Harris depicts of a story in which there are two men who broke into a family's house. They take a baseball bat and hit the husband in the head repeatedly. Then they make their way up the stairs, tie up the youngest children, then do what they will with the wife and the daughters. Afterward, they decide to light the house on fire, and they let everybody burn alive. To save time, I will summarize his main point off of the heels of this story. He points to and he argues that these two men do not actually have free will. Rather, they were victims of their upbringing, victims of their biological makeup and evolutionary processes. He argues that their actions are a consequence of their experience, a biological process. And he says this, and I quote, this is Sam Harris speaking, "As sickening as I find their behavior, I have to admit that if I were to trade places with them, atom for atom, I would be just like them." He then goes on to say, "If I had his genes and life experiences, an identical brain in an identical state, I would have acted exactly as he did. There is simply no intellectually respectable position from which to deny this. The role of luck, therefore, appears decisive." Pretty heavy. So Sam Harris isn't a murderer or a rapist or a horrific person who's willing to burn a house to the ground with children in it, simply because of luck, because of life experiences, and because of his physical genes being different than those two men. Do you see what he's arguing? He is arguing in his book that even our freedom of the will is an illusion, that is a byproduct of our experiences, our genes, and luck. Therefore, completely removing culpability and responsibility. Which, I have to say, in some small way, I respect. And the reason why I respect it is because at least he's being consistent with his own worldview. Think about it. Atheists can be atheist and believe in evolution. But if they have any grounds to argue for morality, being objective, they're being inconsistent with their own worldview. At least Sam Harris is consistent. Because what he said at the end conclusion of these two men that are willing to participate in such an atrocity and do this to a husband and a wife and their kids in the middle of the daytime, they only acted the way they acted because of their biological makeup, because of their genes, and because of luck. At least he's being consistent. Because he doesn't believe in free will. How could you believe in free will if we're just goo to the zoo to you? If we're just evolved pond scum, there's no such thing as free will. Atheists are people who deny God and actually believe we come from the Big Bang and there's nothing in this world except matter and motion. No soul, no mind, just a brain and physical atoms. Don't actually give their worldview a hard look. And therefore are not consistent about what they think. So people like Sam Harris, who is consistent as an atheist, argues that mankind has no freedom of the will, which, when you think about it, he's right, if his worldview of atheism is correct. For example, if evolution is true, then there is no immaterial soul. If there is no soul, then there is no freedom of the will. If there is no freedom of the will, then there's also no such thing as being rational or to have knowledge. Let me unpack that a little bit. If evolution is true, then there is no such thing as an immaterial soul. If there's no such thing as an immaterial soul, then there is no such thing as individual free will. If there's no such thing as individual free will, then rationality and knowledge cannot exist. Because if you think about it, as goo to the zoo to you and as evolved pond scum, we evolved. Everything that you think, believe, and act upon is based upon your biological makeup in the atoms. In which case, every belief that you have, every thought that you have, including that all Christians are hypocrites, you came to that conclusion based upon your biological brain farting one day, and you came to that conclusion that all Christians are hypocrites. If that's the case, you cannot have reason and you cannot have knowledge. Why? Because you don't have free will. Because think about it. If you're going to take two examples of, let's say, a Christian belief that they're tenable and it's a viable worldview, and on the other hand, there's the option of believing that Christians just believe in the sky daddy, the spaghetti god monster, the Easter bunny Jesus, a god that doesn't exist, and you have these two options or two conclusions. And as an atheist, if you're looking at these two options, okay, you didn't come to one option over the other based upon knowledge and reason and what is more objectively verifiable. Rather, you came to one option over the other because your brain had I almost said a not so good word, fart, let's just say. And it farted out the opinion that this is more likely. But you didn't come to that decision because of reason. You came to that decision because, again, your biological atoms, your evolutionary processes brought you to such a perspective. Are you with me? You cannot have free will in such context. You are just matter in motion, evolved pond scum, a cosmic miscarriage. You're an accident. And what does a meat machine, how can they be held responsible for any of their actions? How can just a meat machine, the processes of biological evolutionary processes, ever be held accountable because they're just acting in accordance to their evolution? That's why Sam Harris says he would be just like them if you were to trade atom for atom, gene for gene, and unfortunately, bad luck. It gets worse for the atheist, because if you do not have free will and you have two options in front of you, like just described, your opinion was not arrived at because of knowledge and rationality. Rather, you came to the conclusion because you're predetermined to have been done so. They're a Calvinist, basically. They believe in predestination or predetermination, in which case everything you do is because of evolution, because of the cause. If you're in a car and somebody hits you from behind and you hit the next person, and then that person hits the next person, who is morally responsible in such context? Your evolutionary process. It's predeterminism just wrapped in the bow of skepticism and postmodernism. Are you with me? Atheists cannot even be rational or have knowledge, and that's funny because they're always the ones passing themselves off as the intelligent ones. Maybe they don't understand the full cost of their worldview. Sam Harris does. Therefore, just like Sam Harris admits, no such thing as objective morality. No such thing as freedom of the will. If you think about it, if Sam Harris is correct, then there is also no such thing as responsibility, culpability, and worse, no such thing as justice. At least no such thing as reasonable grounds to justify justice here on earth. Because after all, the axe murderer, the rapist, the thief are all acting in accordance to their biological evolutionary processes with no free will. Therefore, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, and the teacher who took advantage of the student or little girl who never got caught here on earth have escaped judgment. There's no such thing as punishment or judgment or balancing the scales. There's no such thing. Rather, in the vacuum of the purposeless universe, everything is vanity anyway. Everything is pointless. No sense in trying to be moral. You might as well lift the restrainers off yourself and do what your biological makeup causes you to do. It's more of a mystery to me how atheists are consistent on wanting to try to be moral, but their own worldview is bankrupt and they can't account for any grounds to be moral. All right. We've already defined evil as having a privation or lacking something. Evil is lacking something. It has no purpose. Evil is something in which somewhere in the design or the ultimate standard of which a thing ought to be, oughtness, there is a breakdown somewhere, correct? Like the eyeball not being able to see. It's a breakdown, it's a privation. Or the chair not being able to support one's weight. Well, an atheist would have to assume there are no moral laws, no moral standards, nothing a human being ought to do, correct? If they're being consistent. Well, in so doing, don't they also deny the existence of evil? Think about it. If there's no oughtness, if there's no ultimate standard for morality, aren't they also in essence denying that even evil exists? If there's no purpose, no design, no standard of a thing having oughtness attached to it, for example, a chair ought to stand on 4 legs, supporting the weight of a human being, or a book ought to have a beginning, middle, and end. For example, if my wife walks into the kitchen and she sees the water boiling, and she says, "Why is the water boiling?" And I turn to her and I say, "Well, babe, because it's at 160 degrees. The metal is touching the pan to where it's causing a boil throughout the water. And that's why you have boiling water." She would look at me and want to hit me and say, "You know what I meant. Just answer the stupid question. Why is the water boiling?" What is she asking? She wants to know the oughtness, the why, the purpose behind the water boiling. An atheist may be able to answer a question of why somebody is moral, but they can't answer the question of why ought someone be moral. Are you with me? What was she after with her questions? She's wanting to know the oughtness, the why, the final cause, the final purpose of the water. And then I told her after wising up and said, it's boiling because I wanted to make some tea. Well, if human beings have no oughtness, they ought to love one another, they ought not to murder, then in essence there is no such thing as evil. Have fun looking the mother in the face who is the victim of rape and the murdering of her husband and tell her there's no such thing as evil. Have fun. Just matter of motion, baby. Just stardust bumping into stardust. That's all you are. Now, anyone within their right minds would have the free will to restrain themselves in admitting that. Or would they? Well, they have the free will to restrain. I guess not, if evolution is true. Now, let's touch upon free will for a minute. We have already established that evil is contingent upon goodness in order to exist. Just like shadows, in order for them to exist, there must be sunlight. Let me say that again. In order for shadows to exist, there must be sunlight. Sunlight can exist without shadows, but shadows cannot exist without sunlight. Are you with me? I argue that similarly, love, in order for love to be in existence, there must also be the freedom of the will. Think about it. Love can only be love if and only if it is freely given. Love can only be love unless it is freely given. If I had a button up here, then I pressed it, and my wife automatically responded in love. Is she truly loving me? No. Therefore, I argue that in order for love to be truly loved, it must be truly given. And in its fullest sense of the word, it must be real love. Real love is what is most freely given. And being that in 1 John chapter 4, verse 8, God is love. Therefore, as God is love, he would also create creatures capable of love, entailed within the necessity of their very existence, would also have in their being the ability to have freedom of the will. Thus, endowed within their very existence is the ability to love, and in that same spirit is the possibility for shadows, or the possibility for sin. Are you with me? So why is there evil in the world? It's a privation of good. And endowed within man and the ability of man to freely love, it must be freely given. Does that make sense? Church, we have to be better about pointing these things out. We have to be armed. We have to be prepared. We have a culture who is so antagonistic against the things of God. If we do not know how to defend what we believe, we're in trouble. And for those that are in a place of doubting, or those that are in a place in which you have struggled giving everything you have to God, can I encourage you tonight? You need to answer the question of God's existence. Does he exist? We looked at one facet that could support his existence. If moral absolutes exist, then God exists. Moral absolutes do exist, therefore God exists. So, in light of all the other worldviews, whether it's atheism, agnosticism, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, we must look at all of the worldviews. And if we conclude, which rightfully so, that Christianity is the most tenable, most comprehensible, most robust, and the most true worldview that there is, and we have come to that conclusion in and of ourselves that God exists, and yet we don't give him everything we have, then we're fools. If you are living your life day by day, one crisis to the next, one emotional goosebump to the next, if you're not living for God sold out because you think to yourself, I have time, it's a scary place to be. Because in all actuality, if God exists and you don't give him everything you have, you're a fool. As Psalms 14:1 says. And so being sold out, part of that is loving God with all your mind and being prepared to answer the skeptics. Because once you get a hold of this material and you can look to the atheist, the agnostic, the skeptic, the person with objections towards that of Christianity, and you have a reasonable theodicy, you have a reasonable defense, you very well may have just removed a stumbling block in his mind to get him to fully commit to the things of Christ. Are you guys with me? Okay. It's about 5 minutes till. I think we'll have Caleb come up for some response, and then we'll jump into...
Can I ask one
Yeah,
question?
go ahead.
I'm sorry, it's killing me on the inside. It's a question about Sam Harris. So with his example of not really being free will, that was their biological makeup, all that, from Sam Harris's perspective, would he convict them of a crime? Like, would he put them in jail? Would he punish them in any way? Or would he just, that's just how they are?
Yeah, he would argue that culturally, via cultures, we get our morals. And and I've heard him in several debates, he's stated that goodness is whatever is for the best interest of mankind thriving and to their preservation. So for him, goodness or moral absoluteness is grounded within whatever is best for humanity as a whole. He doesn't say it individually, but as a whole. And then, of course, I would come back and say, well, wait a minute. If there's a man who's, in fact, 6'5", 300 pounds of pure muscle and has amazing genes of a god, isn't it in his best interest and our humanity as a whole to rape every woman he gets his hands on? Because essentially spreading his seed is what's going to be best for humanity. So that would be something that I would propose to Sam Harris being an option because it makes sense. Now, in light of what you just asked, as far as is there, would he have grounds to convict them? He would say culturally, as a culture, we deem those things wrong, right? And of course, the very common response, well, Hitler, right? So Hitler decided, what if Hitler actually won in World War II and he deemed all the Jews to be annihilated? And the whole world, are we supposed to just accept that as the law of the land? Does that make it morally right? Yes. And so morals and moral absolutes come from a ultimate highest standard of morality. But remember, God is not good like we are good. God is independent from what he does. His goodness is independent from what he does. Goodness is not something he does. Goodness is what he is.